How's it going, everybody? Jared Lutz here, back with another Diablo 4 video. Today we are talking damage stacking, what it means, how it works. I'm going to simplify all of it for you, so even if you're brand new to Diablo, you'll be able to not only understand how damage stacking works in Diablo 4, but you'll be able to explain it to other people who might not yet know about it. What I will say before we get started is, once you know how damage stacking works, it's going to limit your choice in terms of what affixes you look for on gear. And when I say affixes, what I mean is the bonuses attached to gear. Like here, for example, these are called affixes. So if you're still within the 1 to 50 leveling process and you're maybe new to Diablo as a series, or maybe you're more of a casual player, I recommend you hit level 50 on your own first before watching this video. That's mainly because you don't really need to be optimizing damage for the early game, and for me, learning the game, learning the affixes, experimenting with different pieces of gear during the initial 1 to 50 leveling process, that's a very fun part of the game, and I don't want anybody to miss out on that. When you know how damage stacking works, you'll start to realize that some affixes on gear are significantly worse than others, and it will begin to limit your choice as to what you want to see on gear. And you don't really need to be worrying about that until you're in World Tier 3. But if you're the kind of player who wants to maximize damage all the time, and you want to know the best way, the optimal way to stack damage, then keep watching because I'm going to explain it all. You could also be in a different scenario entirely where you just don't feel like you're doing enough damage. It's taking you 20 minutes to kill a dungeon boss, or maybe you see your friends or other players slaying out and you're thinking to yourself, why is my build not performing that well? Enter in damage stacking. Let's begin. To explain how this works, I'm going to be using this Damage Theory Spreadsheet that has been made by different members of the Diablo 4 community and tested vigorously by them as well to compact all of this information and make sure it's correct. Snowraven, Woody Joe, and tons of other people worked on this damage theory. I'll leave a link to this in the description. I know it may look daunting, but I'm going to explain it so it's super easy to understand. So, in Diablo 4, there is what the community is calling damage buckets. These buckets aren't technically viewable in the game or anything, it's simply a term coined to explain how damage stacking works. In total, there are 5 of these damage buckets. The first bucket we're calling the main stat bucket. If you didn't know, each class has a main stat that directly adds to the damage of all your skills. For Necromancer, it's Intelligence, Barbarian, it's Strength, Druid, it's Willpower, Sorcerer, it's Intelligence, and Rogues is Dexterity. For the most part, you want your main stat to be the highest of the 4 stats because it directly impacts your class's skills damage. Do note that this isn't to say the other stats aren't important at all, because they definitely are, but the higher your main stat is, the more damage your skills will do, so that's the first bucket. The second bucket is what we're calling Damage Plus. This is the largest of the buckets in the way that it contains the most bonuses within it. Any affix that says damage versus, or damage while, or damage to, or damage with, or damage from, or plus percentage of damage, I'll have examples on screen for you. All of these affixes with text like this fall inside the Damage Plus bucket. The third bucket is the Vulnerable bucket. This one is the simplest to understand. Within the Vulnerable bucket exists everything related to Vulnerable. Vulnerable is a debuff that all classes can apply to enemies in different ways. When an enemy is vulnerable, they take 20% more damage. This percentage can be increased, but at base it's 20%. Enemies can also make you vulnerable and make you take 20% more damage from them. When you are vulnerable, it's indicated by cracks in your health globe. You yourself becoming vulnerable has nothing to do with the damage buckets, but I figured I'd throw that information in there. The fourth damage bucket is the Crit bucket. This contains anything that increases your critical strike damage or your critical strike chance. And the fifth and final bucket is the Damage X bucket, or the Global Multiplier bucket. There are no gear affixes within this bucket. Instead, you can find global multipliers, or Damage X, via active and passive skills in your skill tree, legendary aspects, and things on the Paragon board. Anything that has this little X inside brackets falls into this bucket. Okay, so now we have our 5 damage buckets. How do we use these to maximize our damage? So when the game calculates damage, it takes all of these buckets and multiplies them together. So to make this super easy and understandable, let's say you're a sorcerer who wants to focus everything into frost damage. You want to be a frost mage. So on your gear, you might be looking for affixes like increased damage versus chilled enemies, and increased frost damage, or increased damage versus frozen enemies, and increased damage to crowd controlled enemies. All of these affixes fall into the Damage Plus bucket. So for example, let's say within this bucket, all of your affixes together equal out to 9% more damage. In reality, this number makes no sense. This is just to give an example of how this works. Using low numbers here is just for the sake of understanding it easier. So you have 9% more damage within this one bucket. And for the other buckets, let's say you have a 2% damage increase from these three and then just 1% in the last bucket. You've barely dived into crits, vulnerable, your main stat, or damage X. How the damage stacks is these buckets multiplied together. So you'd have 9 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 1, giving you a potential 72% more damage. So what if we balance things out a bit more? We take away some frost-based affixes, so let's take 5% from here, moving this 9% down to 4%, in order to make room for more vulnerable stuff, maybe add more to our main stat, get some crits going, and acquire some global damage multipliers via our skill tree. Now that 5% that we took away is spread across the other 4 buckets. Now we're less focused on frost, but have a little bit of everything. When we multiply the numbers together now, we've gone from 72% to 324%. It's much higher because we're not going all in on one single bucket. Once again, ignore the exact numbers here. This is just to showcase how diversifying into each bucket is much better than solely focusing on one or two. So how do you implement this knowledge into the game? How do you, as a player, feed as equally as you can into each of these buckets? Because let's say you don't do vulnerable at all, or you aren't hitting crits or leaning into crits, you're losing out on 2 full buckets of damage, 2 ways to multiply your damage. That's why I said at the beginning of this video that knowing how damage stacking works really begins to limit your choice, because no matter your class or your build, you need to be doing some vulnerable damage and you need to be doing some form of crits, or else your damage is going to suffer big time. So when it comes to gear, you want to look for pieces that dip into as many buckets as possible. For example, on one of my weapons for my druid, I have plus damage to poisoned enemies. This goes into the damage plus bucket. I have plus vulnerable damage, which goes into the vulnerable bucket. I have critical strike damage with earth skills. This goes into the crit bucket. And I have 189 willpower, which goes into the main stat bucket. So with this one item, we're dipping into 4 of the damage buckets. Now, depending on your build, you can sub out some buckets here and there for certain pieces of gear. For example, my druid build utilizes lucky hit a lot, so I want to increase my lucky hit chance wherever I can. So on one of my rings, I instead have lucky hit chance increase instead of incorporating a damage bucket here. So there is still some choice depending on your build, but for the most part, you want to dip into as many buckets as you can at once. I do also want to point out that attack speed works kind of as an invisible damage bucket. Attack speed doesn't directly add to your damage, but it makes you attack faster so you can do more damage in a shorter period of time. So attack speed is always good to have as well. And that is it. That is damage stacking in Diablo 4. That is how it works. If you have any questions for me, leave them in the comments and I'll try to answer them as best as I can. Hopefully this helps anyone understand how this works, and hopefully I simplified it enough to be absorbed in a much easier way. The link to the Damage Theory Spreadsheet I'll leave in the description for you. Subscribe for more Diablo 4 content. I've got lots on the way in terms of guides, tips and tricks for new players. I cover Diablo 4 news as it breaks. Lots of stuff on the way. Thanks for watching, and until next time, peace.